Welcome back, everybody. This week we're going to be discussing the Founding Fathers, who the Founding Fathers were, how we remember them, and we will also examine four of them in depth. So let's get started. The term Founding Father was first used in 1916 by Senator and future President Warren G. Harding. He used the term when giving a speech to the Republican National Convention in Chicago. He said, quote, "We ought to be as genuinely American today as when the Founding Fathers flung their immortal defiance in the face of old world oppressions and dedicate a new republic to liberty and justice." End quote. This was 80 years after the last Founding Father, James Madison, had died. So who were the Founding Fathers? What is the criteria to be considered a Founding Father? They are most often described as being the politicians, soldiers, jurists, and legislature who held leadership positions during the American Revolution through the early days of the Republic. This list is further broken down into three categories: the signers, who, as the name implies, signed the Declaration of Independence; the framers, who are the men who attended the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia and framed the Constitution; then there's a third group, who are considered both signers and framers because they participated in both events. The core group of these revolutionaries who we will be talking about today fall into the third category and are Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson. Let's start with Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was born in Boston on January 17, 1706. He was the 15th child born to the English-born Josiah Franklin. In his early years, he attended school and became an avid reader. However, when Franklin turned 10, his father revealed that he could no longer afford to send him to school. So, then Franklin started working with his father at his candle and soap shop. Then when he was 12 years old, he started an apprenticeship at a printing press which was owned by his older brother James. A few years after joining his brother, he began to write an advice column under the pseudonym Mrs. Silence Dogood. When James, who often mistreated his younger brother, found out about this, he became incredibly angry. Franklin soon grew tired of this rough treatment, and in 1723 he fled from Boston to Philadelphia, even though he had 3 years left in his contract. Philadelphia would serve as his home base for the rest of his life. Then, after a brief 2-year stint in England, Franklin returned to Philadelphia and held various jobs, including bookkeeper, shopkeeper, and even a currency cutter. The 1730s is when Franklin would develop into the inventor and writer that we think of today. During the early years, he published several pamphlets and used the money to buy his own press called the Pennsylvania Gazette. He would go on to organize the Volunteer Union Fire Company and publish the first edition of the Poor Richard's Almanac. Then, starting in the 1740s until the end of his life, he ventured into science, inventing items such as bifocals, the rocking chair, and the flexible catheter. He also discovered the Gulf Stream and started experimenting with electricity. In 1748, he dove into politics and was elected to the Philadelphia City Council. He continued to rise through the ranks, and in 1751 he was elected to be a representative in the Pennsylvania Assembly, a position which he held until 1764. 2 years later, he became the royally appointed Postmaster General and moved back to England. After writing a scathing pamphlet called Causes of the American Discontents before 1768, in response to the Stamp Act, he was fired and sent back to the colonies in 1775. There, he was elected to the Second Continental Congress, became the first Postmaster General for the colonies, and helped to draft the Declaration of Independence. Soon after independence was declared, he was elected to become the ambassador to France. His mission was to raise support both in terms of money and military aid. He would spend the Revolutionary War there, where he was treated as a celebrity and lived very comfortably. He returned to America in 1785 and 2 years later would be elected to represent Pennsylvania at the Constitutional Convention. He was the oldest delegate at 81. Then, at the age of 84, after struggling with a variety of ailments, Franklin passed away. Fun fact, Franklin was known to be quite the ladies' man and is said to have possibly had many illegitimate children. Moving on to John Adams was born in 1735 in Quincy, Massachusetts. He was the descendant of Puritan colonists, and at the age of 16, he would earn a scholarship from Harvard University. He would eventually get a master's degree and become a practicing lawyer. Adams's political career also started with the Stamp Act. He wrote a response to the bill entitled Essay on the Canon and Feudal Law. He argued that the Stamp Act deprived the colonists of their basic rights to representation for tax purposes and trial by jury, two elements that would become fixtures in the American Constitution. Despite his belief that the colonists were being unfairly treated, he was a very grounded lawyer. In fact, in 1770 he represented the British soldiers who were on trial for the Boston Massacre. He believed that the facts of the case were more important than the reason why the attacks happened. He was able to get the 6 soldiers acquitted and earned a very positive reputation. It was so favorable that in the same year he was elected to the Massachusetts Assembly and was a representative at the First Continental Congress. In 1776, Adams proposed and got a resolution passed that each colony should have an independent government. The preamble for this resolution would later serve to be a jumping-off point in the passing of the Declaration of Independence. He was also a part of the Congressional Committee in charge of drafting the Declaration along with Benjamin Franklin, Robert Livingston, Roger Sherman, and of course, Thomas Jefferson. Although it would be Jefferson who would write the first draft, which Adams would always regret he did not do. Over the course of the next year, he would serve on 90 different committees, more than any other congressman. Then the next year, he became the overseer of the Continental Army. He was also placed on the ballot to become the first president, but had to settle for vice president to Washington. Then in 1796, he was elected to be the second president of the United States with Jefferson as his vice president. Fun fact, Adams and Jefferson would be both friends and enemies for the rest of their lives. They even died on the same day, July 4th, 1826, and Adams's last words would be, Jefferson lives, or Jefferson survives, even though Jefferson had actually died earlier that morning. On to Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was born outside Charlottesville, Virginia in 1743. He was born to wealthy planters and was the third of 10 siblings. He attended the College of William and Mary and was not the best student. In fact, it took him 5 years to graduate, which was double the usual amount of time it took for others in the same course of study. He became a lawyer and had a very successful practice. He became a patriot, like the other two, as a result of the Stamp Act. In 1768, he was elected to the House of Burgesses and quickly joined the radical wing. While he was there, he wrote a summary view of the rights of British America. This would help establish himself as a great writer for the American cause. Then in 1775, he attended the Second Continental Congress, where he was placed on the committee to write the draft of the Declaration of Independence. It would take Jefferson 17 days to draft the document. However, on July 2nd, 1776, the draft was accepted for revisions, which Jefferson hated and resented that they felt the need to revise any of his words. Then, on July 4th, as we know, 1776, the document was signed. After independence was declared, he traveled back to Virginia, where he served the Virginia House of Delegates for 3 years. While there, he wanted to make the Virginia Constitution mirror the Declaration of Independence, which he did in several ways, but the most major way he did this was to establish the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom in 1777. This established freedom of religion and the separation of church and state. It would actually take 9 more years for it to actually be passed, but Jefferson would later say that this was one of his proudest accomplishments. Then he would serve as the second governor of Virginia throughout the better part of the Revolutionary War from 1779 to 1781. He would then write his controversial book, Notes on the State of Virginia. It would be in this work that Jefferson would contradict himself by saying that he was against slavery even though he owned slaves. He was one of those who believed that all the slaves should be sent back to Africa. He then found himself thrust back into political life in 1783, where he would represent Virginia at the Confederation Congress. Then he would serve as ambassador to France for 5 years, and after coming back to the United States, he would serve as Secretary of State, Vice President, and then the third President of the United States. He would actually spend his twilight years organizing and planning the University of Virginia. It was actually the first secular university in the country. He passed away on the 50th anniversary of the signing of Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1826, just like Adams. Fun fact, Thomas Jefferson sold his personal book collection to the Library of Congress to replace what was burned during the War of 1812 fire in Washington, D.C. And his catalog, the way he cataloged his books, was actually the very first system for the Library of Congress. Remembrance. These are just 3 of the founding fathers. There are so many more, and it seems like their names are all around us. We remember their contribution to society through schools, such as Benjamin Franklin High School, which is right in front of UNO. City and county names or parish names, such as Jefferson Parish. Then there are countless documentaries and plays dedicated to their memory, as well as house museums, such as Monticello, Jefferson's home. However, the biggest day of remembrance, where all the documentaries are played and everything, has to be July 4th, when Americans shoot off fireworks to remember the signing of the Declaration. This celebration was actually prophesied by John Adams. He said, quote, "The second day of July 1776 will be the most memorable in the history of America. I am apt to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated as the day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shoes, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other from this time forward forevermore." He may have been off by a couple of days, but his sentiments have proven to be true. So, who were the founding fathers? By most people's definition, it's these great men, the fathers of democracy, the men crowded around the table, trying to work out the Declaration of Independence or frame our Constitution. But should we limit the founding fathers to these great white men? Many say that this term should apply to many other people who didn't sign the Declaration and who didn't frame the Constitution, but contributed just as much. Many historians believe the definition should be broader to include people like Thomas Paine, who effectively kept the Continental Army from deserting, or Abigail Adams, who would serve as a key political advisor to her husband and would actually at one point melt down her silver to create bullets for the army. And there's James Armistead, a slave who would eventually serve as a spy against the British and would inform the Americans of Benedict Arnold's betrayal. He also was he was in Yorktown's camp, so he would actually mislead Yorktown. Excuse me. These few and countless others are forgotten faces who should also be considered founding fathers of the American Republic. So I guess at the end of the day, we really need to rethink who we think are the founding fathers. Thank you for listening. We'll see you guys next week.